sort of overwhelmed by all of you sitting out here, and I hope I won't bore the daylights out of you for the next hour. I will ask that we hold questions to the end. It's going to be a long talk, longer than they like, and I know some people are going to be going to dinner afterwards. So anyone that wants to ask me questions, I'll take question and answer after the talk.
So, and we're having a little difficulty hearing back here.
Okay, can you hear me now? Because this was a problem, we were testing my. Can you hear me now? I just need to make sure I stand here. If I turn my head, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I'll try and talk loud too. I'm usually accused of talking too loud. So.
Much is different from too loud.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's gonna be, I'm afraid when you leave, you're going to say not only was he too loud, but he talked too much. I'm going to try to do it. With just a couple more people coming in, and I do want to get started as close to the time as we can.
Evening, everyone. Nice to see everyone here and a house full of drivers. I'm surprised there's not like water running down as you empty your wetsuits on the way in. My father used to say about me, don't be humble, you're not that great. But with Ed Schultz, you don't have to say that. Ed is actually, can't hear at the back? Is this better?
Yes.
Wow, that's pretty cool. When it comes to introducing Ed Schultz, it's a very long introduction, but I'll actually read it because it's actually pretty. We shortened it. But so Dr. Schultz, as many of you know, was born in West Hampton Beach, New York, in 1952. He learned to scuba dive in Grand Cayman in 1967, and in 1968, his family moved to Bermuda, where he worked during the summer months as a dive instructor and offshore dive guide from 1969 to 1973. He became a regular member of Harry Cox's dive crew on Shearwater in 1972 and continued to dive with Mr. Cox until his death in 1997. Aboard Shearwater, he met Bill Gillies, who became a lifelong friend and frequent dive companion. Those of us who know Bill Gillies know just what that means in terms of experience and knowledge. In 1998, Dr. Schultz also joined Mr. Tucker, Teddy Tucker's dive crew, on a regular basis and continued to dive with Mr. Tucker until his death in 2014. He met former Nantucket resident Peter Benchley while diving with Teddy and shared many adventures with both men in Bermuda since in Bermuda. Okay, we're not going to talk about me.
We should.
Ed and I have done some diving, and it's been really, really informative and very useful for, as I like to say, pinning the tail on the donkey. There's a lot of things I thought I'd understood about what I was looking at, and Ed has sort of managed to clean up a lot of the data, so to speak. There's shipwrecks that we, know are there, but we don't know the history, we don't know who dove them. And Ed, because of this extensive and broad experience, has been able to kind of patch together or stitch together the many patches of knowledge that make up, what is a long tradition of looking for shipwrecks and finding shipwrecks in Bermuda. Anyway, carry on. While residing in Florida, Dr. Schultz lived on Key Biscayne and had the opportunity to dive on numerous shipwrecks lost in Florida Keys, including some of the 1733 Spanish treasure flotilla wrecks, as well as the Nuestra Senora de Atocha, sunk in 1622. Dr. Schultz returned to Bermuda on a full-time basis in 1988 when he became the Director of Emergency Services for King Edward Memorial Hospital. He remained in this post for 30 years, serving after 2001 as the Chief of Emergency Services and Hyperbaric Medicine. He has served both as a Deputy Chairperson and Director of the Bermuda Hospitals Board since 2018. We're all very thankful for that. Sorry. Dr. Schultz met Crystal Virginia Schroes in 1971 at the University of Miami, to her great just kidding. Luckiest person in the world.
Lots of judgment.
And married in 1977. Ms. Schultz, who was also an avid scuba diver, taught marine biology courses and served as the Science Department Chair at Gulliver Academy in Miami prior to becoming the Education and Research Coordinator for the Bermuda Underwater Exploration Institute, where she was absolutely valuable in building the programs and making this institution what it is in terms of education, sort of outreach specialist. She continued in this post until her retirement in 2019. Our education classroom has been named in her honor. Dr. Schultz and his wife reside permanently in Bermuda, but spend the spring and fall months at their home in Nantucket. While in Bermuda, Dr. Schultz continues to dive on a regular basis. That was the shortened version. Obviously, just briefly, I don't know if we've all had this experience. The amazing thing about Ed, or Dr. Schultz, is that and I'm sure everyone in this room has had this experience of walking into the emergency room, because we all have depended on that at some point in our lives, or some of our loved ones. And I can't tell you the unbelievable relief I felt to sort of see him walk into that little waiting room when you're waiting to figure out what's wrong with you, or as it was the case with me with my child, with their head split open at age 2 from here to here. And there's an absolute sort of sense of calm that comes with Ed's presence, and his level of expertise in medicine is, I want to say it can't be surpassed, but it's at least paralleled for his expertise in all things shipwrecks and history. And his passion is infectious in both realms, and he is a constant, consummate teacher. I know there's lots of people in the audience who have experienced that from Ed, and it's wonderful that he's actually sharing all this with everyone in Bermuda. And thanks, Ed.
No, well, thank you so much for Now that you've enjoyed the show, I think it's time to go. No. So, just a disclaimer. Today you always have to, do a disclaimer. So, first of all, if you came to see beautiful underwater, spectacular photographs, you bought the wrong tickets. Russell's probably going to have a show next year, but you're not going to see him here. They're really for historical interest and not artistic content. The other thing is, some of you are going to be appalled by what we did in past years on shipwrecks. We removed items without mapping. We tore reefs apart to get at shipwrecks. But I would just ask that you judge us in the times that those things occurred, because those were perfectly acceptable behaviors then. They're not now, but they were then. And last of all, I may make some mistakes. It's certainly not by intent, and it's by accident. So if anyone sees anything that I said that's incorrect, please see me after the meeting. And don't raise your hand during the meeting. So you already have heard, I wasn't born here. I was born on the south coast of Long Island, in a little town called West Hampton Beach. And the southern shore of Long Island is just littered with shipwrecks. There's over 1,000 wrecks. Ships trying to get into Boston and New York, bad navigation, storms. They wrecked. As a child, I could see these wrecks swirling in the breakers at the beach in several areas. And after winter storms, huge sections of ships, or an entire bottom of the ship, such as this schooner, were actually uncovered by winter storms. So from a very early age, I had an interest in shipwrecks. My father and grandfather were avid fishermen. That's all they lived for fishing. My grandfather retired to Florida in 1949, and every winter we would go down to Florida. My father would take his vacation, and we would fish in the Florida Keys. I was 4 years old when this picture was taken, and at the time, they were just finding the 1733 wrecks in the Florida Keys. So as a little kid, I heard all these stories of finding Spanish sunken gold and silver in the Florida Keys. And obviously I was intrigued. About the time that picture was taken, my parents bought me my first book on the sea at the shocking price of 25 cents. And I love this book, I still have it, but the page that affected me the most was this page. And I'll sort of read it. It says, divers dive deep down into the sea to collect its treasures. They look for oysters that have pearls inside their shells. Or they dive down to a sunken ship. Sometime divers help to bring back some of the ship's cargo. I knew from that age on that all I wanted to do was dive on shipwrecks and find things. And it's never left me. I still have that infectious desire to go out and dive on the grid. My first childhood hero was Jacques Cousteau. My first nonfiction book I ever read was The Silent World, in which he and Gagnon were diving on shipwrecks in Marseille Harbor that had been sunk in World War II. My next hero was this guy. Believe it or not, in West Hampton Beach in the elementary school in 1963, they subscribed to Spin Diver magazine. And I read every edition, and I read about this man. And I remembered 3 things about the article. The first one was that he and his brother-in-laws, the Cantons, had found a fabulous treasure on the wrecks of the San Pedro and the San Antonio. The second thing was he used to go out and dive on a schooner, which I later learned was a Blanche King, to collect coal to burn in the fireplace in the winter. And the third thing I remember, and I remember this the most, they ran a salvage business, and they thought they found a bunch of cable that had been discarded by Cable Wireless in the harbor, so they hauled it up on the boat. And his brother-in-law, Bobby Canton, went to saw through it to salvage it, and the lights went off in half a Somerset. and I don't know how Bobby survived, but he told me that the hacksaw blade was vaporized. My first shipwreck adventure was in Grand Cayman. So my family started fishing in the Florida Keys, and then we moved to the Bahamas, and we fished in the Bahamas. And then by the mid-60s, we're going to Cayman, and this ship was the Ridgefield. It was a World War II Liberty ship that wrecked there in '64. Teddy did a pamphlet. We actually took aerial photos of it. And when I dove on it, it was actually completely intact. It looked like a ship had just run ashore, and I was able to get up into the bridge. I got over 100 sharks out of the bridge. A ship this size will carry about 2,000 sharks. My first solo dive, my first dive in the ocean was taken in Grand Cayman. I look like I'm pretty heavily armed in this picture for 10 feet of water. But the year before this picture was taken, my dad and I were fishing in 60 feet of water in a small whaler, and we encountered two 15-foot tiger sharks eating the 300-pound sea turtle. They actually came up and were biting through the shell. So between that and looking over the side of fishing boats in the Bahamas, watching 300 to 400-pound marlin torn to bits, I've always had a healthy respect and fear of sharks, and I freely admit it. I never took a diving course. What happened was I got a 1959 book, Let's Go Diving, published by US Divers. We had a friend in Cayman that had a pool, a regulator, and a tank. He showed me how to clear my mask and regulator, and it was off to the races. So I've been making solo dives since 1967. My family moved to Bermuda in 1968. We lived in a house on Harrington Sound in Shelly Bay. That was my first underwater camera. It cost me $60. It was made by Nimrod. My first mentor in diving in Bermuda was actually a man called Bobby Robbins. I went to school with Michael Robbins at the base school because I wanted to go to an American university. Bobby had come out as an American in the armed forces here, married a Bermudian. He had done diving at Argus, wrecking Argus Island. That was very dangerous diving, 200-foot diving, day and night, to put in the wiring at the base of the tower. By the time I met Bobby, he was the dive instructor and dive master at the Reef Roamers. The Reef Roamers at the time were the largest dive club in Bermuda with over 100 members. They were for the base personnel, and at that time we had a US Naval base, Air Force base, and Coast Guard base in Bermuda. Bobby's first boat was a Yes Yes. This is a boat I started diving in Bermuda on, and my first shipwreck dive was the Pallania at St. David's. At the time, the bow and the midships of the boat was pretty smashed up. It had wrecked in the 1940s. But the whole stern of the ship was intact, and you could actually swim under the ship, the midships. I don't know if it's still like that or not. I haven't been there for years and years. The midships had broken, and these are the huge pistons in the middle of the ship, which I think is pretty impressive. And at that time, and again, I don't know if the stern still, the whole stern was intact. You could actually go down in the hatches. Here's the spare anchor. And that's not actually an engine telegraph, that's a sounding station for lead. They were still using lead weights to determine depths at the time. I had two adventures with Bobby. And my first one was really my first day out towing for shipwrecks. So what happened was Bobby had registered the shipwreck of the HMS Cerebus at Castle Rose for 6 years. And he wasn't finding much, it's the musket ball wreck. And he wanted to register the wreck of the Superior, which sank in 1836. Edmund Downing had had the wreck registered for 6 years, and he'd given up the lease. We went out and tried to get Edmund to tell us the marks on it for like a whole afternoon one day, and he wouldn't tell us. So we went out looking for it. And this was a wreck we were looking for. It's out to the west of North Rock. And I was terrified. You know, we're dragging on a line behind a boat. I was sure a shark was going to get me. I was looking backwards more than forwards. And we came across, late in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock, we came across this huge anchor chain on the bottom. And later we found it was the anchor to the Mediana. Maurice Schaefer started down one side, I started down the other. Bobby was in the boat. We started to get so far away, he thought he'd be going to lose us. So he went and picked up Maurice first, and I was still swimming offshore on the anchor line. And all of a sudden, Bobby drove the boat almost on top of me. He yanked me out of the water. There was a huge shark fin following me down the anchor line that I didn't saw. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen Shark Country video, but there were a lot more sharks in those days than there are now. And this is why we wanted to find the Superior. There were thousands of tumblers, glass tumblers. It had a general cargo from Le Havre to New York, and it got blown in here on this series of canals. And Harry's crew found a case of wine bottles with the wine still intact. My greatest adventure with Bobby, one of the scariest adventures I ever had diving, was with his second boat, the Nest Egg. Now, if you look, whoops, hit the wrong button there. If you look closely, you'll see that there's two compressors on the back of the boat, and there's a large dive platform. So in 1974, we went out to work in airlift on those two compressors on the runway. We went out on a day, it was blowing about 15, 16 knots. Crystal clear day, not a cloud in the sky. We took 2 airmen from the base to tend the boat, and Bobby and I both used Navy doubles. Now, that meant we could stand at the bottom for 3 or 4 hours working the airlift. We put 4 anchors out so the boat wouldn't move because we didn't want the airlift moving around. And about 2.5 hours into the dive, suddenly we were violently jerked to the side of the sandhole. How could this happen? We got 4 anchors out. We surfaced to see what was going on, and it was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It was now blowing 70 miles an hour, not a cloud in the sky, but blowing 70 miles an hour. And I don't know if, I think most of you probably don't want to learn, all the reefs at Lurmen were coming out of the water. There were 15-foot breaking seas all around us. We had snapped 3 of the 4 anchor lines to this boat. In one of the most incredibly bad judgments of my life, I said to Bobby, you get on the boat and I'll go get the other 3 anchor lines and tie it to the big anchor. And that's what I did. So by the time I got up, the sea conditions were even worse. Somehow Bobby got in the boat. By the time I got up, the entire stern of the boat was coming up at the crest of the wave, so I could see the propellers. And it would come down and the waves were going over the stern of the boat. Now, I had 100 pounds on my back. I had a 30-pound weight belt because we had winter wetsuits. And I had 2 Navy doubles, which are about 35 pounds each. And I weigh 160 pounds. I weigh 160 pounds in. I said to Bobby, I said, if that platform comes down, it's going to kill me, you know. And I had a rock pick. I said, do you mind if I throw the rock pick into the grate and then you try to pull me on board? He said, no, you know, do it. So I waited. When the platform went down, I threw the rock pick where I thought the platform would be. And when it came up, it pulled me up. I was completely in the air out of the water. And Bobby, who was a big man, he's 6'2", he stepped out on the dive platform, grabbed the yoke of the doubles with me in it, and put it in the back of the boat. When I got in the boat, the windows had been knocked out, the glass windows had been knocked out of this boat. The 2 airmen were comatose, semi-comatose in the bow of the boat. We had to call the ambulance when we got in shore. And the entire, I don't know if any of you looked out to the North Shore today, but the whole reef line was breaking. The whole reef line was breaking on chub heads. And we had to run almost the length of chub heads to get across the bar, taking seas sideways through the side of the boat. This was thousands of dollars to the boat, and it was amazing. One night in June of 1969, Bobby said, I've got to go down and work on the compressor at Breck's Diving School. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. He said, I've got to go down and work on the compressor at Breck's Diving School. Do you want to meet Park Breck? And I said, sure. So we went down, and Park had come here during the war, married a Bermudian. He started the dive school. He said he was the only dive operator that had actually graduated from Harvard Business School. But his great-grandfather had sold his steel business to Andrew Carnegie in the 1800s, so he didn't have to worry about money. He was living on the trust fund. He was quite a character. And he'd started out with Gene actually taking divers off the South Shore. They had a truck with a compressor on it, and they would pump these tanks. And if you ever see the original 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, these are hydropacks when the regulator comes off the base. But the conditions on the South Shore many days are just too dangerous to take tourists off the beach. So eventually they rented the diving school, and let me see if I can use the laser. Can anyone see that? Yeah, there we go. You see that? That's the Breck's Diving School. So he rented this from the Little Johns. He sank an anchor here. He sank 2 cannon there. And he sunk a pilot boat as a shipwreck offshore. And we had 3 or 4 different dives that we could take tourists on. This is one of the posters. And the shipwreck dive was really sort of silly. We had a wooden chest out there that we put these fake coins in. If you went on the shipwreck dive, you've got to take 1 coin. You know, one day I had somebody out there that thought they were real, and they tried to empty the whole chest. And I was like, right, we're going, no, you got to put them back. He should have guessed they weren't real. The little hole for the keychain. The best thing about working for Park was, with Park, you only work 6 days a week. 7th day was Sabbath, and we all went diving with Dave McLeod. So, and we went wreck diving because Dave loved wreck. So, in those days, Park would rent half of Dave's dive boat, and the Bermuda Dive Club would rent the other half. And there were the sort of the forerunner of the Bermuda Subaqua Club. And they were mostly either policemen or foreign workers that worked in hotels or restaurants. And I made many lifelong diving friends with that group. So we would just go out and dive all day on wrecks, and if we would either work on wrecks or, Dave had to find a lot of the wrecks and dove on because Teddy wouldn't always tell him where things were. So we would sometimes spend days looking for wrecks. And that's Dave. Dave and Kevin Burke both ran dive businesses in the 60s and 70s. They came out here, they'd been in the British Merchant Marine after the war. They came to Bermuda, they liked it. They served at Maitre D's at restaurants, and eventually they had their own dive businesses. And I ended up working for Dave. I worked for Park 2 years, and I worked for Dave off and on for 3 years. And then I occasionally would sort of do short-term work for him after that for a couple of years. We used to teach tourists in the pool at Pompano because Dave ran out of Pompano, Kevin ran out of Sonesta Beach, and it's pretty scary when you think about it. People who didn't even know how to snorkel, we would teach them how to snorkel, to teach them how to use a scuba tank, and then take them out in 40 feet of water and have them dive on the reef, all in the same day. How we didn't kill anybody. And every year I said, I'm not going to do this another year, it's just too dangerous, but then I think, God, I want to go dive. And so this is the motley crew. We look like a bunch of pirates. That's Dave, me, Ross Corden, and Billy Rosser. And the gentleman at the far right is Charles Basin Sr. He actually built both of Dave's boats. He just sat down without any blueprints, built those boats in his backyard, and he was very well educated. The day this picture was taken, we actually moved a 1,000-pound engine into Dave's second boat with nothing but an inclined plane and rollers. No lifting equipment, and those are the two boats. They're Sinker 1 and Sinker 2 at the dock at Pompano. Dave liked to dive on wrecks because he'd been in the Merchant Marine, so we dove on the wrecks on the south shore as far east as the Pollock Shields, and on the north shore as far east as the Cristobal Colon. One of the wrecks we dove on a lot was at Darlington. It was a short run from Pompano. When we started diving on, all the portholes were running, all the brass portholes were running. Teddy hadn't salvaged at Darlington because the portholes were too small, they just weren't worth it to scrap. But they were really easy to get off, so I could get them off with my dive knife. So Dave would actually have me take portholes off, and we would give them to some of our regular customers as souvenirs. I also found the brass, or the copper mast in Atlantic to the Darlington. This is one of the remarkable features of it, the steering gear, and it's still there. Where we dove the most was the Constellation in Montana. The Constellation was the last schooner that was in the general cargo trade on the east coast of the United States. It wrecked in 1943, almost on top of the Montana. When we started diving on it, when I started diving on it in the 60s, the Toreador worms had already eaten the hull, but all the cargo was still there. And Wendy might correct me on this, but I think there was china in those 50-gallon drums. China glassware. The most remarkable feature of the wreck are all the 90-pound bags of Portland cement that hardened when the ship sank. And this picture I took in 2019 from the surface is not an underwater picture. The water was so clear that day I took that from the surface. And here I am with my second underwater camera, a Brownie Starflex in a plexiglass housing. And there were just glasses and plates and you name it, everywhere on the wreck. After Peter Benchley wrote The Deep, which combined the wrecks of the Pollock Shields and the Constellation, everybody wanted to find medicine ampules, so everyone would be out there fanning for medicine ampules, and after a short while it became very hard to find them. One day the Bermuda Dive Club wanted to lift the deck ventilator. Fortunately, Dave wouldn't let him in the boat, so hopefully it's still out there. But we did bring up the cash register from the wreck, as well as 2 rolls of tickets to Coney Island for 1943. I'm not quite sure what they were. The Montana Nola was wrecked in exactly the same location, almost 80 years prior. And the most remarkable features that, of course, are the big pagoda boilers on it. The bow was intact until a few months after this picture was taken in 2019. Again, these are pictures from the surface. You can see the paddle wheel. And this is a picture from the 70s where we're actually taking the tour to the stern of the wreck. The other wreck, the other Confederate blockader of the Sank Marine, of course, is in Marie Celeste. This is a more challenging dive. It sank, you can see the lighthouse in the background off the South Shore in 50 to 60 feet of water. Its most notable feature is the upright paddle wheel. The other paddle wheel is laying on its side. The engines are exposed. And here's one of Philippe's drone photographs where, if you look closely, you can see the bow here. You can see the paddle wheel and the engine in the stack here, and you can see the stern back here. So what we would do is we would anchor the boat here in 10 or 20 feet of water, show the tourists the anchor, follow the 50, 60 foot sandhill to the stern, go out to the bow, come back, and then come up the reef and come back. One time we had two of the worst divers we ever had. They used to be regulars with us. And one of the kids wanted to bring a slurp gun and a net to catch fish and a camera and everything. I said, you can't take that. It's not this kind of dive. You have an hour and it's 60 feet. You have to keep moving. You can't be buggering off. Anyway, he kept going off the whole dive. When we got out here to the bow, we had less than half a tank, and I knew we were going to run out of air. I had to physically drag him the last half of the wreck. And when we just got up on the reef, we're about where that marker is, and there were no markers in those days. We had a 5-man panic. Everyone ran out of air and panicked. We didn't have VCs. We had little flotation vests to inflate with CO2 cartridge. So Dave and I had 5 people waving their arms, and we're ditching weight belts and inflating vests. And as this kid's drowning, he said, "Oh, save my camera, blah, 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 save my camera." My mother said, "You idiot, you're dying, don't worry about it." You know, all this stuff's floating off. Charles Baston Jr. was on the boat that day as skipper. He saw us, he cut the anchor line, came down, got everybody in the boat. I kept my eyes on all the gear as we loaded. I got everybody's gear back, even the kids' cameras, slurp gun, net, everything. On the way in, the father comes to me and says, "You know, you saved our lives today. I want to give you something very special." And I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Here," he gave me $1 tip. So I went to Ross, accordingly, and I said, "Ross, I can't believe it. This guy gave me $1 tip," which even then wasn't a lot of money. And he said, "That's right, Eddie, that's about what they're worth, 50 cents a piece." We dove on the Cristobal Colon a lot. Cristobal's a massive wreck. It takes about an hour to go from the bow to stern. And when we were out there diving, the bow was largely intact, as was the stern. This is some of the deck here towards the stern, and you can actually go in the cabins in the stern, you know, and you can see the tiles and the rooms. The Americans had bombed it so that the stern section had actually fallen over on its side. I hadn't been out there for 40 years. Philippe took me out there with Stuart Joplin a few years ago, and it's just a stack of plates. It's unrecognizable. This entire wreck has been collapsed by the hurricanes. My favorite wreck was Lermany. It was an open wreck, so in those days you could make things, and there were things all over the place. We found pewter porringers, we found bottles, I found an hourglass, a French wine glass from the captain's cabin. It was always fun. And it's a very dramatic wreck. The water's usually clear there. There's cannon all over the bottom. It's just a great wreck to dive on. One of my favorite wrecks still. This is the iconic cross cannon in the sandhill near the windlass. Some years later, it's a very popular place for photography. Some years later, I used an airlift with Teddy in that spot, and in the entire oak gun carriages for these guns are buried in the sand, as are cutlasses and an unbelievable array of artifacts. Still there, completely buried in the sand. Teddy told me, I didn't believe it until I actually saw it. They're there. There used to be huge keel spikes, like 4-foot keel spikes, and sadly in the early 70s, somebody saw those off as souvenirs. Two of my friends in the Bermuda Dive Club, Alex Arnfield and Graham Maddox, introduced me to this man, Harry Cox, in 1972, when I started diving with Harry on an initially not very frequent, but an increasingly frequent basis. And I dove with Harry for 25 years. Harry had formed the Bermuda Divers Company in the late 50s, along with Rob Whedon, T.J. Watson, and Than Butterfield. Than's still alive, actually. I met Than for the first time this last year. And they had an old Maine lobster boat. They took tourists out on Sundays and Thursdays. By the time I started diving with Harry in '72, we had a brand new dive boat called the Shearwater. You can still see Shearwater today on the waterfront. It's tied up at the waterfront probably right now. One of the first crew members on Shearwater that I met was this man. Bill Gillies. He was very quiet, he always spent all the time in the water, he loved to tow, and he didn't say much, but if he said anything, it was either very profound or very funny. In the summer of '68, in fact, I think it was the end of July in '68, Bill was being towed looking for wrecks after they made a couple dives on another wreck called the Portobello wreck, and he saw a small trail of ballast up on the reef in about 10 feet of water. Now, there are hundreds of trails of ballast like this out on the reefs, and you don't find anything on most of them, but every once in a while you get lucky. Bill dove down to look at the ballast, put his hand down, and he put his hand right on a 4-foot elephant tusk. So that's pretty interesting. So they dropped the buoy, they started to make circles, and as they made circles in the nearby sand hole, they found broken Spanish olive jars and lignin vitae logs that were brought back from the New World by the Spanish in the 50s. So they knew they had a pretty good site. They didn't find the ship, so they went back and dove on the ballast trip. They were in the water about 20 minutes, didn't find anything. They're just getting ready to leave. Harry scanned one last time, and he saw gold. And when you see that little trail of ballast, it's hard to realize what the ship would have looked like, but it would have looked like something like this. And that's what they found. So what you're looking at is blue glass Venetian trade beads, stamped gold, which meant whoever had that gold had paid the quinto real, or king's fifth, in taxes to take the gold legally back to Spain or Portugal. But they also had unmarked gold, so those ringlets are unmarked gold. Somebody was smuggling that back, probably on their arm that they were wearing. The entire treasure at this site was probably just one man's personal possessions. They did find a magnificent gold ring, and almost 2 years later to the day, Bill found the emerald that fit inside from the mine of Chiva. And at the time, that asteroid, they'd only found 12 astrolabes on shipwrecks all over the world. Since that time, many more have been found. That was a fairly significant find. They found Spanish olive jars on the wreck and Ming Dynasty porcelain. Now, this is the wreck site, and when ships hit reefs, they do damage for centuries. If you look very closely, you'll see a trail across the reef here, what Teddy would call a scrub mark, and that's where the ship went across the reef. So all the treasure was found up here in the ballast. This big sand hole down here, we found broken olive jars and lignin vitae logs. So our thought was the whole ship has to be down here buried in the sand hole. We didn't find any ship's fittings, we didn't find any cannon, nothing, just a little bit of cargo. So Harry bought the new Shearwater so we could mount a large compressor and we could use airlifts to dig this hole out. That's Willie's boat, that's my boat. This is obviously a modern drone picture. Remember those two rocks. So here's Harry's new compressor. He called the Backer Shearwater Harry's backyard. He had two 15-foot airlifts that he could run off that compressor. And we would carry the airlifts to the site, and we would dive every Sunday and every Thursday. At the base of the reef, because we figured we could use the reef contour to go down, Harry would actually throw 3 full tanks overboard and jump overboard with a weight belt and no fins and walk over and put the tanks on and then stay down until all tanks were emptied and either make a free ascent or come up with the last air of the tank. They were using the airlift. We always were uncovering brittle sea stars and worms, so we're really popular with the fish. If you look closely, in his mask, there's a little trade bead in there. Harry always wore speedos so he didn't have any pockets. So he had to put anything found in his mask. And because it was an inside the bar, we could dive anywhere. And you can see here, we've actually gone down 15 feet. And you can see that rock that I told you before, and there's the reef. And at 15 feet, we were still finding pieces of timber and broken olive jars. We only found one piece of 8 down there, and we found the silver teapot, but we never got down to what might be the wreck. So is this a bounce, and the rest of the wreck is in the lagoon, because it was headed into the lagoon? Is the whole wreck there in the sand hole? Who knows? Another picture of the treasure, and Harry holding the asteroid. After a couple of years of diving, and my assignment when I started diving with Harry was working the fallout, which is quite frankly the shittiest job on the boat. You have to sit there to see if any gold beads or blue glass beads are falling down. You just get covered with sand. You're combing sand out of your hair for a couple of days. So we started dragging for new wrecks after we didn't find anything for a while. And what you do with dragging is you hang onto a rope and you look for something that doesn't belong in the reef, such as this river rock ballast, or maybe a subtle trail of ballast. Sometimes you're not quite sure whether it's ballast or coral rock. An anchor certainly indicates there might be a shipwreck there, but an anchor could be a long distance. A lot of times ships ditch their anchors and then recover their anchors. So here's an 18th century anchor, here's an 18th century anchor heavily grown into the reef. We would buoy those and then work our way in circles, but work further inshore, suspecting the wreck might be there. Timbers can be misleading. Timbers can go for a quarter or half a mile from a wreck site. As the wreck broke up, timbers stripped in all directions depending on the wind. And every once in a while, you just find loose artifacts sitting at the bottom, such as this mallet bottle from 1740. Here's a crucible on the crucible wreck, and here's a late 18th century one, just laying out in the bottom. Sometimes drift from shipwrecks, sometimes maybe from a fisherman, who knows. I love to tow because I would, about every third or fourth time I'd find a bottle, which was good fun. When you found something, you had to drop off, and that's okay in a calm day, because you figure the boat's gonna find it. In a rough day, you really wanna make sure the boat knew that you dropped off, because you didn't wanna be left alone out there. And if it was something worthwhile, we would drop a buoy and do circles. If there was something significant, like a large iron fitting or a large ballast drop, we would get off and investigate with tanks. So here's a large ballast drop. My wife, Chris, dived on that. I think it's safe to say, without exaggerating, that by the end of the 1970s, Bill and I were Harry's two most trusted divers when it came searching for wrecks. And we would tow all day if he let us, because we never got tired of looking for wrecks. When Bill had the best eyes of anyone I've ever dove with, I think. One day he was out 15 feet of water, he saw this on the bottom, he said, that doesn't look right, I think it might be a pistol. He dove it up, they x-rayed it, it was a pistol. And for those who know Bill Gillies, he's a master at conserving artifacts. And he conserved the pistol, there is in that picture. He later conserved the barrel and firing mechanism, and this has been on display here at the UEI, and it has been on display at the Bermuda National Museum. Now, let's go dragging. We're dragging, we're looking for something, we're looking for a wreck, we're looking for an artifact. Who can identify any, would you drop off in this picture, or would you keep on going? Volunteers, anybody want to volunteer? You don't want me to come and pick you, you want to volunteer?
Yeah, I will drop off.
What do you see in that picture?
I'm not sure.
Does anybody see anything in that picture? Raise your hand if you think you see something. What do you see?
Looks like a bottle.
Where? Show me. Where? Oops, hang on.
Okay.
Over there, show me.
Okay, go up, to the right. There, right there.
You got it. Bill saw this, and it's not a bottle. It's a perfectly intact 18th century stoneware jug with the handle still on it. And Bill's actually dragging behind my boat when we found this, and he actually had to take pictures, and he uses it in his presentation. So we didn't always find wrecks dragging. You could also see them on the surface on a calm day. Here's the bow of the North Carolina. There's the bow from underwater. Here's the windlass and the anchor chain from the fossil wreck. And there's the steering gear you saw before from the Dolphin. And here's a cannon in a sandboat from an unidentified wreck we found in the Southwest. Just a couple cannon there. Now, does anybody see the shipwrecks in this picture? This is pretty obvious. I love to sit in the window seat in an airplane because I look for wrecks every time I fly. You see the shipwrecks? How many shipwrecks are there?
3.
Maybe 3, definitely 2. See that? Yeah. And see that? Yeah. So
The
see
trail?
The island's way over here. So there's Morgan Shadow. So the island's here. So both of those wrecks were where? They're in the lagoon. 60 feet of silly, dirty water. And dragging with Harry, dragging with Teddy, dozens of ballast trails that lead into the lagoon. So I think that's where the good wrecks are. But it also shows how long the damage occurs to the reef when the ship hits the reef. In addition to diving on wrecks, I will dive for bottles. In the 60s and 70s, there were bottles everywhere. Another one of my friends from Bermuda Dive Club, Michael Davis, bought a boat in the early 70s, and we would use it to dive in the dockyard for bottles. Because we figured with the Royal Navy there, all those guys drinking, they'd be throwing a lot of bottles overboard, and we were right. The Cable Wireless had the Sentinel there at the time, and they used bow thrusters. They would blow a hole down to bedrock, and we would bring up 70 bottles in a single dive. There were that many bottles. When we first started diving there, the entire outer wall there was covered with brass shells from destroyers from World War II. They just dumped them at the end of the war instead of recycling. And there's a picture of Mike and I'm smoking a pipe from the mid-1850s. The only time I ever smoked a pipe. We also knew that the convicts had been kept in dockyard in these prison halls. So it made sense that there might be some good stuff under those prison halls. And we had lots of drawings and photographs actually to know where they were located. So the 9,000 convicts built dockyard, 2,000 died. They lived in overcrowded conditions in these prison halls. And nobody really knew how disease was transmitted in those days. Most of them died of dysentery or yellow fever. And they thought yellow fever was transferred by contact with a person's possessions. So when these convicts died, everything was thrown overboard. And this is the bottom of the dockyard. It's dirty, it's silty. If you look closely, you'll see some bottles from the mid-1800s there. There's a part of the mandible from a horse. There's a more modern hole there. But there was just tons of artifacts under these wrecks. Here's an artilleryman's badge. Well, what that represents, somebody lost their hat one day, and that's all that's left. And here's some small finds from under the convict hulks. I don't know what they were doing with silver anchor, but there's a silver anchor there. There are buttons that are convict buttons. There's parts of a telescope. There's parts of a brown vest musket. And the convicts were forging coins out of lead. I don't know how they did it, but they were forging coins, and there's some forged coins there as well. These are some of the bottles that came out from under the convict hulks that date to 1830s, 1840s. Those clay pipes still had tobacco in them, so they must have fallen out of their mouths while they were smoking. And those are snuff bottles at the base. Here's some of the convict carvings. So what happened was the prison service paid the convicts 3 pennies a day. 1 penny was for room and board, which wasn't very good. 1 penny was held in escrow, so if you survived and were released, you weren't released penniless. And the other penny was given to the convicts to buy tobacco or things they wanted. Well, that didn't go very far. So they would carve calcite from the caves and make little toy cannons and chess pieces and ladies' jewelry, the long pieces of ladies' jewelry. And they would sell them to the military people or to the Bermudians to get money to buy tobacco. And they also carved Archimina coral. They also carved bone. In addition to diving in dockyard with Mike, we would dive on the iron wrecks, and here we are diving on the Cristobal Colon, getting portholes. And Mike and I almost bought it on the Cristobal Colon one day. We're out on the day, just the two of us in his boat. It was blowing a little hard. We probably should have been out there. We threw 2 anchors over, and Mike had trouble with his gear. We spent some time getting his gear sorted out, and we went off the back of the boat. It was dirty water. It took us a while to get up to where the anchors were to check on the anchor, and my heart sank when I found the anchor and the rope shaken through. So I was praying that the other anchor was still there. When we got to the second anchor, the 2 anchors had been over this piece of jagged metal just chafing. There was one of the 3 strands holding the second anchor. If we'd gotten there 15 minutes later, I would be in this lecture today. Mike and I had our best diving, I think, of all Mills Breaker. Mills Breaker is a shipwreck grade where there's 3 ships on top of each other. There's a sailing ship from the 1700s that's wooden. There's an iron-hulled sailing ship from the end of the 19th century. And then there's a Colonel William Ball on top of it. And Teddy and the Cannons had heavily salvaged the Ball during the 50s and 60s. There was a lot of mass on it. This was also a dive that the reef runners did. They did checkout dives there. And I didn't think there'd be much there, but Bobby found this object, which is a solid brass binnacle for the compass that the U.S. Navy put on it around 72, 73, and he showed me the wreck. And Mike and I went back out there, and we really went out to get portholes off of the sailing ship. So at the end of the day, we went over to the Ball, and I figured it'd be nothing. We started finding all kinds of stuff on it. There'd probably been hundreds of divers on the wreck, and it had been salvaged already. Does anybody know what brass bicycle chain is used for on a ship? Raise your hand. What do they use brass bicycle chain for? You know, you're not allowed to answer. You heard this. Anybody know? Brass bicycle chain. The bridge engine telegraph. So we started following it, and then we lost it under some places. We followed again, and finally we found where all these chains went under a big plate in the girder. So with about 20 minutes of air left, we cut through the girder, put a lift bag on the plate, and lo and behold, the entire bridge of the ship was there. That's the engine telegraph. That's me bringing the engine telegraph in. We had the brass mount for the wheel. We had what was left of the wooden brass binnacle. We had so much brass in the boat that day. We had about this much clearance in the boat coming in. It had been a rough day. We were In 1975, in January 1975, Bill Gillies, Graham Maddox, and Harry were out looking for wrecks around Northeast Breakers. It was a cold day. Bill and Harry had enough, and Graham snorkeled over to the breaker, and when he did, he found that big jug on it right there, sitting right up on top of the breaker. They then got out and looked around, and they found the rest of these artifacts in potholes on the reef. They didn't think the whole ship would be there, because it's right next to the Prince David, which was another checkout dive for the reef roamers. This was a cruise ship that had gotten off, but they dumped a lot of cargo there, so it was a popular dive site. People would find bottles, China on it. And the other thing that's amazing is all these breakers break, massive breakers in a hurricane or a gale from the north. So how anything survived out there is absolutely amazing. They started looking around, and there was little bits of ballast poking out of the coral. So the thought was, well, maybe the whole ship's under the coral. And we basically dismantled the reef there, and indeed, the whole ship was under the coral. And what we've done here is, you can see, we've chopped through the coral, and then we found the ballast under the coral. And then under the ballast, we found the cargo, which should be just the opposite way around. So the ship must have turned upside down and dumped this cargo. But the ship wasn't here. We didn't find any chain plates. We didn't find any well, we did find cannon, but we didn't find any fittings from the ship. So presumably the hull of the ship broke up and drifted away. But what we did find are all these funny things over here called manillas. We didn't know what they were, but they were used in the slave trade on the west coast of Africa. And at one time, 20 manillas was used to purchase a slave. Some years less than that. There were thousands of these on the ship. We actually, in one dive, brought up 147 manillas. And I've been working with Dr. Jarvis. It's doing the dig out at Smith's Island, and some people in Europe. We think that the manillas were melted down by the Benin people to manufacture Benin bronzes once Europeans came in contact with the Africans, as the Portuguese made their way down the west coast of Africa in the 1500s. So here we're excavating. You can see there's bricks there. We hit a wall, a 4-foot wall of beads, of trade beads. Just thousands and thousands and thousands of trade beads. Whereas 20 manillas might buy a slave, a single one of those blue beads could be used to purchase a slave on the west coast of Africa. Pretty awful testimony to man's inhumanity to man. And I had Harry re-register the wreck in 91, and even in 91, we're out there diving. People have been diving on the wreck for 20 years at that point. There were still beads. The sand was just filled with beads. They didn't find the first cannon until September. So we found the wreck in January. We dug until September to got to the cannon. The cannon were under the ballast, like the cargo, and under the cargo. So, just the opposite of what you would think. And there were 24 cannon, including one magnificent bronze Dutch East India cannon that had been manufactured in Groningen in 1686. So we think it's a Dutch ship. The bottles were Dutch. And we think it sank around 1740. It was a great wreck for metal detecting because the hull wasn't there. So if you had a hit, it was going to be a manila or shot or some other metal artifact on the wreck site. When we left the wreck site in 1997, we left the cannon. We always left the cannon in situ except for the bronze gun because it was a popular dive site. I hadn't gone out there for 20 years. I went out with Philippe a couple years ago. The cannon was smashed to bits by the hurricanes. It's unrecognizable. It broke my heart to see it. After 77, we started looking for more wrecks, and we started on the breakers east of North Rock. Every single breaker east of North Rock, we either found ballast or an anchor or an anchor. We also dove on breakers to the west of North Rock. One of the popular ones was the Emerald Seal wreck, where there were these magnificent glassed emerald seals for sealing wax. We call it emerald seal because it had these little faux emeralds that would have been in a fine gentleman's dressing attire. We found some very nice bottles from the 1790s. We also found some George III coins there. And Harry found an octet right up on top of the breaker. After that, we started diving in deep water. Teddy had found the Union in deep water. Harry wanted to find a deep water wreck that hadn't been found. So we started just doing Star Trek dives, going out 100 feet, throwing the anchor over. It was great for underwater photography, but we didn't find any wrecks out there. We almost got killed out there another time. I was very proud. I had this picture in here because I bought a new mushroom anchor for shearwater at PW's Marine. And because I thought the other anchor was rusty. About 10 days after this picture was taken, went out on a day where it was blowing about 15. Harry used that. I said, we should set it down for it. No, we'll be fine. We were all kitted up, 6 of us, about to go over. We're in 100 feet of water, a hell of a current, hell of a sea running. Just as we were about to go over, we heard it, boom, and the boat went sideways. The post had pulled through the mushroom. If we'd gone over 2 minutes sooner, there was no one on the boat, we never would have gotten back to the boat. We would have just been swept off the top. We never made that mistake. We always left someone on the boat after that. Harry's last great find was in '83. We went out a day, it was crystal clear and calm. We found 6 shipwrecks from the surface, the last being Lermany, and he said it was time to tow. So Bill and I got on the tow lines and we went out into deep water. Out in about 60 feet of water, we found a big piece of iron, which I thought was from a freighter. It didn't look very exciting, but we put a buoy on it because it was in deep water. We then towed around, found 2 anchors that we never found again, and it was getting late, so we went back and dove on the wreck. And as usual, I was the first one over. And I literally landed on this on the bottom. It was stuck on the top of the reef. You can see where I chopped it out. Anybody have any idea what that is? Any ideas? I knew immediately that that was a breech for a breech-loading brass cannon. It's brass. The handle's broken off. That's where the powder goes, where the hole is. So I said, there's a breech block here. There should be a brass cannon here, right? Does anyone see the brass cannon in this picture? It's there. Just gotta look for it. See a brass cannon? Volunteers?
In front.
Tell me which part of the slide. That doesn't look like a cannon, does it? It looks like a brass ring. But it was the only thing I saw, and I said, it's gotta be the cannon. So I went around, looked down a cave, and sitting perfectly perpendicular to the bottom is a magnificent bronze swivel gun. And that is where the iron tiller screws into the cannon. So here you can see, we're lifting it out of the cave, and you can see now the breech block in the cannon. And there's the gun. So at this site, we found 11 breech blocks. This was the only cannon we found cloaked. And Mendel Peterson dated this, I thought, to the 1580s. When I came back in '88, we got involved with a hyperbaric chamber, and I was lucky to be able to dive on the Sea Venture with Smokey Wingood. Smokey was chief diving officer, and I actually gotten licensed through him in the early 1970s. He invited me to dive on the wreck. The keel is lined exactly up with the beach of Fort St. Catherine. He hit the last reef. We would have put it right up on the beach. And John Adams from the Mary Rose Trust was the diver at the time that I dove with. And you could actually see the wood shavings where they chopped out the iron fittings for building the Deliverance. We also dove in the harbor, and Teddy's favorite saying was, one man's trash is another treasure. One day diving in Harrington Sound, we got a red light. I still had a little bit of air in my tank. I said, can I make a dive here? And we just threw an anchor out in the middle of Harrington Sound, and I went down, and that was sitting on the bottom. And I thought, when I first saw it, I thought it was going to be a big jug. When I turned it over, it turned out to be a brass and copper barrel. Someone had actually used it as a trash can and filled it with iron bolts, iron springs, and glass, and dumped it in the middle of Harrington Sound. The iron protected the brass and copper, so it was in perfect condition. It took me a month to get it chipped out with a demo pick, and I later learned that this is the diving helmet that Teddy Tucker learned to dive with. And just to prove that, Philippe found this photo of his great uncle on the dive boat. Whoops, I went too fast. On the dive boat, and there's the helmet. Teddy worked the pump at the aquarium to take tourists down before the war. And at the end of the day, he and the other boys would go down and use the helmet. One wreck that we looked for never found both Harry and Teddy. Teddy and the Cantons were coming in from diving on the Eagle one day, and they saw 3 brass cannon in the bottom at 60 feet of water. And, you know, Bowen's map references a rich Spanish wreck lost in northeastern Greece. Well, for a Spanish ship to be carrying bronze guns, it's very likely Amarante or Capitana carrying treasure, so it should very well be a rich wreck. They weren't able to locate that. Clay Blair also came across an account of this wreck where they brought up Carib divers, but they couldn't recover anything from the wreck. Harry told me for this, Teddy told me for this. We never found it. I do believe it's there. Ross Stowe, who was a spearfisherman but not a wreck diver, saw it on a calm day and actually dove down and touched the barrel of one of the guns. So we think it's there. Harry died in '97, and this man I started diving with in 1988, who I don't think needs any introduction. Teddy had been my hero for years and years and years, and we started diving on his dive boat at that time, which was Miss Wendy, and we started diving on the Western Ledge wreck, and we were working with the Bermuda Maritime Museum. They were going to remove some timbers from the wreck, and we wanted to excavate for artifacts. We did find a few coins and some beads on the wreck site. Another of the wrecks that we dove on was a tankard wreck, because Teddy found a huge pewter tankard on this. And this was a fascinating wreck. There was ceramics basically from all over Europe on the wreck. And somebody had been collecting shells from all over the world, and their shell collection went down with the shipwreck. So we had Indo-Pacific and Atlantic shells. So using the airlift. Teddy also worked the fossil wreck, and I got to work that with him. If you go down the shipwreck gallery downstairs, you see the ship's lantern that was buried in the ballast on this wreck. I was with him when he dug out 2 perfect wooden box compasses under the ballast. How they survived, I don't know. And when the ship scooped up ballast, it actually had fossils in it. With Teddy, it was always the ship, the construction of the ship. With Harry, it was the artifacts. With Teddy, he loved ships. He went to sea at an early age on schooners before he went into the Navy. He loved how ships were constructed. He loved to paint ships. And he had contacts all around the world that could tell him where the wood was made, where the ballast came from. So it was really a completely different perspective of shipwreck diving when you were diving with Teddy. I have to laugh because Bill Gillies bought these fins in Miami in 1991, and those are the fins I used today, 33 years ago. So I can't be accused of not recycling things. When you went out with Teddy, you never knew who was going to end up at the dock. One week it might be the Cousteaus, the next week it might be David Doubilet or Henry Christophe. You know, all the diving, legends of the world ended up at Kings Point from one time to another and went out diving. Here's Peter Benchley, who dove with Teddy a lot. Peter had come down and did an article on shipwrecks for National Geographic.
We can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Just about, yeah.
Okay, so Peter had come down to do an article for National Geographic on shipwrecks in Bermuda, and became a very good friend of Teddy, and would dive with Teddy several times a year, and just one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. And Teddy knew all the treasure divers, I think, in the world, and this is when we were down with Mel Fishers, who found the Tosha off Key West. We had the private gold disc out of Crystal's hand at the end of the shoot. This is a Keldysh. Did any of you see the movie Titanic?
Yes.
So did you know that the Russians tested their near subs here? At the time, there were 6 subs that go down to the bottom of the ocean, and 2 were on the Keldysh. And they tested the subs here before they went and did the first movie, IMAX movie, the Titanic. That was Michael Hayward's boat, Explorer, which was one of Teddy's other dive boats before Miss Wendy. And that's the IMAX camera. They could only shoot 6 minutes. The film was huge, and here's the nearest. It was a sad day when Teddy decommissioned Miss Wendy in 2008. He had other dive boats after this, and he continued to dive, but it was never really sort of the same. A lot of his dive crew got ready to die, the same way with Barry. And the other ones that didn't get old, because there's a couple of Nick Hutchins and Mr. Hayward's up here in the front row, they just didn't, die with Teddy as much anymore. So there, gradually it just got to be very hard to maintain this boat. But it's really a shame that this boat couldn't have been saved as a museum, because it could tell a lot of wonderful stories. In April of 2014, I made the international news by having my boat sink on the North Shore while I was solo diving. And sadly, a few months later, Teddy died. And after that, I spent the next 5 years basically solo diving to 2019. Occasionally, I dived with James Rylands, who was Harry's son-in-law. In 2019, we had day after day the clearest water I've ever seen, visibility 200 feet. And these pictures were taken out by Eastern Blue Cut. That's 60 feet of water there in a deep reef.
Wow.
It was just spectacular. And then I started diving with this guy in 2019. And so I still solo dive a little bit, but whenever I can, I go out with a custodian of shipwrecks. That way I hopefully won't get in trouble and be tempted to do naughty things. And this is Philippe launching a drone, and you've all seen his incredible drone footage. There's the South Shore shipwreck site who we were out a couple of years ago, and that's Coral Spawn. People ask me, what's my favorite shipwreck? And I'm gonna end on this, so you can relax, it's almost over, you won't be tortured anymore. My favorite wreck is Bell Wreck. And I contend that Bell Wreck is the oldest wreck that's been found in Bermuda. It's likely Spanish. To orient yourself, you can see the island under Morgan's shadow. You can see Eastern Blue Cut light. And you can see in the two dive boats there, that's my boat and that's Philippe's. The ship actually, what we thought was a wreck, was up on this reef right here, but there was a substantial ballast drop here, 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 and a ballast trail that went into the lagoon. So my theory is, we're just diving on the stern of the ship, and again, the main part of the ship's in the lagoon. Now, the water in this area is incredibly clear. This, Eastern Blue Cut's the best place to dive in Bermuda.
Wow.
So, a few years after Harry died, Harry had started diving on this wreck in the early 60s. And the reason it's called the Bell Wreck is Bill Gillies on his third dive found a bronze mast cut. So we call it the Bell Wreck. We don't have any other ID on it. We really didn't know when it sank. So a few years after Harry died, we went out and I was teaching a friend how to snorkel on the reef. One of my dive buddies wanted to teach his girlfriend, so we were dragging around the reef. And at the end of the day, he said, "Do you want to tow?" So I said, "Sure." Tow me, and I had no idea where we were. And I was just about to quit, hadn't found anything all day. And I see this little neck sticking out of the sand, so sort of the base of one of those reefs. I saw a neck, I thought it was a broken bottle. And I dove down, my finger slipped into the hole, and I was looking at a stoneware Bellarmine from 1550. So we actually now have a date on the shipwreck. On the Spanish treasure floaters, supplies permitting, everyone was given a liter of wine and a liter of water a day, crewmen and officers. Now, the crewmen would have taken their rations in probably a root container, but a officer or a wealthy passenger would have a container like this to tap off their wine and water. And you can date these fairly accurately. We've also found Mercuria blue on blue, China or Majolica on the wreck, and the olive jars date to the period. So I believe this is Bermuda's oldest shipwreck. Now we know there are older wrecks here. The Santa Maria to Portugalete. If you've read Jarvis's book, Devil's Isle of Saints, that sank in 1530 with 2 million ducats of Aztec gold and a large shipment of pearls. The gold content of ducat is 2.5 grams of the purest gold that can be smelted at the time. It was a Venetian coin, it was sort of the standard currency of the time. So the gold content on that ship alone, if you just melted the gold down, would be worth $366 million. That's out there someplace. Yeah. Any rate, that's all. I won't torture you anymore. I hope you enjoy it. It's only 2 minutes short. Any questions? Yeah. Question?
Facts that you brought up, where are they now?
A good question. So, first of all, a lot of the artifacts I brought up with the Coxes and on Miss Wendy went to the owners of the boat. So the rule is that the ship gets first take, basically. You have to actually sign articles on Shearwater that everything went to the captain on that boat. So if they liked you, they would give you artifacts. You have to remember that before the current shipwreck law passed, before 2001, you were allowed to keep artifacts on open wrecks, but you were supposed to register them with custodians. The government was supposed to have first refusal. If you registered a historic wreck, you had a lease for 3 years, but you had to do a report, and the government could purchase the artifacts. If the government didn't want to purchase the artifacts, you keep the artifacts. So a lot of the artifacts I found, I still have. Some of the artifacts I found with Terry and Teddy, I don't have. I've been given a tremendous number of artifacts by Miss Tucker, who's sitting in the front row, which I'm extremely thankful. And I hope that someday my collection will go to the National Museum or a museum that will preserve them. You know, people only live a short while. I was reminded this constantly as an emergency physician. So I'm a caretaker for these things. These things have existed long before I came into this world, and hopefully they'll exist long afterwards. And I would hope they find a good home and are preserved for future generations of Virginians to enjoy. So my entire collection I hope to pass on to the museum.
Beautiful.
Questions?
Tell us a little bit about what might happen to passengers and crew on just a couple of these wrecks?
Sure, that's a great question. So, in general, right up until 1900, most sailors could not swim. So when a ship wrecked, if they couldn't get ashore on a piece of wreckage or in a longboat, you know, they were going to drown. Certainly the wreck at Northeast Breakers, everyone had to die on it because there's no record. And in 1740, there would be a record in the Muir archives of such a wreck. So everyone in that died. Almost certainly everyone in the Bell wreck died. The Virginia Merchant that's wrecked right off Sonesta, when Teddy excavated that, they found all the molars. I think there were 4 or 5 survivors out of 150 people. And they actually found human molars because that was all that was left. You know, the fish will eat your bones, but teeth last for a long time in the sea. I did find part of a human humerus. Harry used to call it the humerus wreck. I found part of a human humerus on a wreck that sank around 1760. But in general, you know, if you didn't have something to float on, you were going to die. And you have to remember, in the 1500s, there were no lights. There were no lighthouses in Bermuda until what, 1850? You know? So, you know, even at night, in the 17 and 1800s, you could wreck on the outer reef and not even know where you were in a storm and drown. You wouldn't even know which way to swim. You want to hear a ghost story before I quit?
Yeah.
So this is the only ghost story I'm going to tell tonight because John Cox specializes in this. While we were looking in the wreckage trail for the Bell wreck, I saw half of a Spanish olive jar in the Bell wreck because, you know, the artifacts fell out as the ship busted up in there. And
Can you stop in the microphone?
Sure. So I figured the other half of the olive jar should be there. So I put a tank on. I was being dragged behind Shearwater by Harry. Put a tank on to look for the other half of the olive jar. And as soon as I went down, I heard this horrible crashing waves and wind in the rigging. And it was just terrifying. It was like a ship foundering at sea. And I thought, oh, my regulator's free flowing. I took my regulator. I even turned my air off and held my breath, and they still heard the sound. And it lasted the whole time I was down. And they made the mistake when I got on the boat of telling Shearwater that I'd heard this. And you wouldn't believe the ridicule that I had. Harry got a piece of white cloth and put it on the phone. Woo! Everyone thought I was nuts. I wish I hadn't even said anything. So, you know, now mind you, we've dove on the Bell wreck probably 100 times or on the wreckage trail. Never heard anything. So after I found the Bellamy, I took my wife, Crystal, out to the site, and it was just the 2 of us on the boat, and I wanted to show her where I found the Bellamy. And we got separated, and she didn't know that this was the wreck, the same wreck, because, you know, I hadn't dove on the wreck, I dove on the wreckage trail when I heard the sound.
It was 7 years later, too.
7 years later, she's gonna correct me, I have to be careful. And you wanna tell him?
Oh, I'll tell him.
Tell him. I had to involve my wife sooner or later.
Usually when I go diving with them, I end up going off in a different direction. And I remember I was going along there, and all of a sudden I heard this whoosh, whoosh, and then I'm not making this up. And it was so loud, I thought, oh my gosh, I thought my regulator must be weak, and I rolled over and everything was working fine. And I thought, what is this? And then in my mind, I saw this hurricane. I mean, a wind blowing and the ship going down. And I'm not kidding, it gave me the creeps. I got out of the water and I told Ed, and he says, and you made fun of me with Harry Cox on the boat. And it definitely must be haunted. Gosh.
So I can't explain it, but it happened twice on the same wreck. Now, mind you, we go there lots of times, we dive there a lot. To me, it's fascinating because you think the ship's in the lagoon, but ballast goes off in all directions, and it's a massive amount of ballast. Any other questions?
Yeah, one here.
Yeah.
So you guys, the heyday of this discovery era, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
Science has changed a lot. We've got much better imaging technology. What can we do with like everything we know to further explore these wrecks and put them in context?
So Philippe, I think would agree with you on this. There's like supposedly 500 wrecks. We think there's a lot more than that here. If we go out just with standard towing, we still find new wrecks almost every time we go looking. I mean, or new drops of ballast or wreckage from a ship. Philippe has found wrecks, as Teddy used to go up in a balloon, a hot air balloon, and look down and see wrecks, just like you could see the wrecks from the airplane. And Philippe has found wreck sites with your drone, right? And you also side scan sonar. You found wrecks with that as well. The problem is the oldest wrecks, the best wrecks, are going to be buried in silt in the lagoon. So you say, well, a magnetometer should work well for that. That's how that's how Mel Fisher found wrecks. And, the trouble here is there is a tremendous amount of debris from World War II on our reefs. The Americans used the breakers. They trained pilots here before they sent them to Europe, and they used the breakers for target practice. The Cologne, I was talking earlier tonight, we were dragging looking for the 3 bronze guns, and in those days, none of the wrecks were buoys, so you didn't really know where you were unless you were looking on marks and land. I was towing behind Shearwater, and we're down to 60 feet of water on tow planes, and I passed like this 500-pound bomb with a tail fin sticking out of the bottom. I said, God, we must be getting near a wreck or a reef. And about from here to where the trash can is, I look over, and there's a 15-foot unexploded torpedo on the bottom. Wow. It had obviously been dropped from a torpedo bomb. So I said, it must be getting near a shipwreck. And I cruise along the bottom, and then all of a sudden I look up, and I'm in like 50, 60 feet of water. Here's the bow of the Christopher Cologne coming straight up like this. And my tow line had actually got caught in the bow rail of the Christopher Cologne. So there was no way I was going to avoid this thing. And actually, if you ever dive on the Christopher Cologne, go up in the bow, and at about 10 feet, you'll see a big dent in the bow, where I drove my tow plane into the bow of the Cologne, because I was afraid if I jumped off, I was going to break the plane and Harry was going to get angry. And I could hear this 1/2-inch nylon line go, like this, and it went boom, and Shearwater jumped about 10 feet forward. But, they bombed everything. I dive out in the harbor for bottles still, and you find they had floating targets out there. There are unexploded bombs and a lot of exploded bombs all over the bottom of Hamilton Harbor. If you look at some of the charts from the 40s, you'll see large areas mapped off unexploded explosives on the map. So you might get lucky. I mean, they found the Warwick with a mag. They found the Warwick was buried at Tuckerstown. They found that with a mag that I think were the explorers did that with Mendel. But in general, it's just so much junk. You're gonna, for every good finding, you're probably gonna find 150. It's just gonna take a lot of time and effort. Now, there are sub-bottom profilers that should be effective here. Stenley brought one in, and when he chartered Teddy's boat, they used it, for a month, I think? But they didn't find anything with it, did they? So, technology is good, and we know there have to be a lot of spectacular wrecks out there, and I think the lagoon is a place to look. But they're going to be buried in silt, and the lagoon is not got the visibility that the outer reef has. So you've got limited visibility to search. Maybe with sub-bottom profiling, maybe with a mag, you'll get lucky. There's got to be. Well, we know there's a wreck out there with $366 million. It'd be nice to find, but today when Philippe and I go out, we see incredible artifacts still on these wrecks, and we just don't touch them. We take pictures. But my problem with that is, and Philippe will correct me if I'm wrong on this, the problem today is there's no projects, there's no really, there's no money and funding to do underwater archaeology. And what's happening is, as we get more and more severe storms, sand is being pushed off the platform. If you ever get Bill's book, if you're interested in this, the two books I recommend is Kenny Tucker's autobiography, Treasure, or Bill Gillies' books, Wrecks, Reefs, and Relics. He's got a picture in there of the sand moving off the platform in a hurricane. Well, that sand's not coming back. It goes out into 1,000 feet of water. So what's happening is the shipwrecks in shallow water are getting more and more uncovered, and artifacts are getting uncovered. Wrecks that we didn't used to see any artifacts now are getting uncovered, and they're being destroyed. I showed you the Cannon Manila wreck are almost unrecognizable now. You know, we went out a couple of years ago and there were two magnificent 18th century porter bottles. One of them's broken. They're both there, but one's broken. So, you know, see, the current thinking is to leave everything in situ if you think puristically, archaeologically. That might work in a deep water shipwreck in 200 feet of water, but even that's not safe because now deep water trawls are smashing deep water shipwrecks. So, you know, it's this balance, you know, you leave it out there, it's going to be lost. If you bring it in, it'll be saved, hopefully, but it has to be conserved, which is very expensive. And the argument from the archaeologists is you need to map it because whether an archaeologist excavates a wreck site or a treasure diver excavates a wreck site, once it's excavated, it's excavated. You can't go back and reconstruct where things were very well. Now, mapping, I took 2 courses in archaeology sponsored by Nick Hutchins, who's here in the audience. And I learned how to map and everything. But, you know, even Dr. Jarvis will tell you, you know, it's mapping on land is one thing. Mapping on a shipwreck, it's dynamic and sand shifts around and artifacts shift around. What does it mean? You know, with a deep water wreck, you can go down and do this all remotely, very accurately by computer. Can't do that very well in shallow water wrecks. So you know, I think there's a lot of difficult questions. I understand why things have to be conserved. We did a lot of damage in our era. You know, I'm not going to say I didn't. The only way I think I can sleep with that is, you know, I intend to give everything to museums. I've never sold anything. I've never sold any artifacts. I've never done it. Because it's sort of sacred to me. It's just the way I am. I guess it's also because I'm a pack rat. Any other questions? Question?
Have you ever tasted any of the wine that you found?
Yeah, so that's a particularly distasteful thing. I haven't tasted it, but they thought, when they found the case of wine on the Superior, they thought they were going to have, you know, the $1,000 bottles of wine. Where they opened it up and it was hydrogen sulfide. They had to clear it. What happened when they opened the booze from the Constellation?
It was terrible.
They have to evacuate to room. So now, on the other hand, Philippe, you tell your story about not wine but perfume. So
It did smell terrible.
did it smell terrible?
Until when it started to oxidize, it actually got better.
All right. So I actually have a bottle of perfume from one of the officers, probably Cologne, from Lerman from 1838. And it's sealed with pine sap. You can smell the pine sap. But I've never opened it, and I'm afraid, you know, it's going to get broken. And I'm afraid what it might smell like. I will tell you one thing. I did find a bottle in the harbor. It was corked. And it was a P.F. Herring bottle, which is cherry liqueur. And it smelled like cherry liqueur. I wish that I had saved it, and I didn't. Because, you know, it's actually maybe still good. But usually it's terrible. The answer is corks are not, you know, aren't, and it just, the ingredients deteriorate with time.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I hope I didn't bore you to tears. Yeah, one more question.
Yeah. So, did you get certified in the end?
Oh,
No,
yeah.
I mean, that's
yeah.
just joking question.
No, it's not. It's a good question. It's a good
My
question.
question is more like you saw a lot, and
Yeah.
I just wonder how you evolved in the last decades and where we are now. Where was the golden age, or are we living it right now?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, so this is the way I look at the world. And I did get certified because I took the test, but I never took a course. Because I had to be certified, because I used to help train the reformers. So Bobby could give me a paddy card, but I had to take the test, I had to pass the test. So this is the way I view the world. Certainly the golden age of diving for shipwrecks, like shallow water shipwrecks and finding treasure in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. And the treasure divers, that's a bad term today, but it wasn't a bad term then. It was a very good term because we brought up things that have been lost forever. Mendel Peterson from the Smithsonian worked with Teddy. Teddy and Mendel developed most of the techniques that archaeologists use today in shallow water. If you want to read Mendel's book, History Under the Sea, you'll see Teddy and Mendel mapping shipwrecks here. The Warwick was mapped. I get a little bent out of shape when I hear the Maritime Museum pretending that they discovered the wreck and they were the first men. I dove on the Warwick with Teddy when he uncovered it. Every timber was marked with red tags, would have all been mapped and marked properly. So Teddy was one of the first, in my view, certainly Mendel was one of the first underwater archaeologists, and Teddy was right there with him. They went everywhere in the 50s and 60s. They were consulted all over the Caribbean on shipwrecks, the Florida wrecks, so that was a golden age, finders keepers, it was great. I knew it would not last because I knew at some point governments would say, no, you can't do that. And whenever treasure was involved, the government really wasn't interested about artifacts, they were interested about treasure because they wanted the money.
Yeah.
So, they didn't buy, the government didn't buy the incredible artifacts in the shipwreck gallery down below us from the Union that Teddy found. It sank in 1760. But they bought the treasure that he found on San Pedro and San Antonio because it was gold and jewels, and they wanted that. So, so the situation now is, in many countries, shallow water treasure divers occasionally can work under contract, or they just can't work at all. Like in Bermuda, you can't remove anything from a shipwreck, basically. Correct me if I'm wrong enough, but it's very difficult. So things are done under archaeological control, but the trouble is, archaeological projects are not occurring and artifacts are being lost.
Right.
So the golden age for shallow water shipwrecks is past. The golden age for deep water wrecks is now, because the technology is there. If Odyssey Marine is going out and finding shipwreck after shipwreck in deep water, treasure, brass cannon, whole ships intact with treasure on board, and they can remotely map with ROVs far better than archaeologists can using simple field techniques like we use in shallow water. So there's this great debate, who owns, it's in Bill's book, who owns artifacts, who owns the past? I have mixed emotions on this. Yes, to a certain extent, everybody owns the past. And I think eventually most of these things probably do need to end up in museums someplace. But does everyone need to own one in millions and millions of rum bottles that were thrown into the ocean or lost in shipwrecks in the 1700s? It makes no sense. So, maybe a representative bottle, but I don't believe that people should be kept from owning things. I was very good friends with Ira Noel Hume, who was the head archaeologist at Williamsburg for many years. In fact, Ira would come and stay with us every year and sort artifacts with me for a week. That's how I know a lot about what little I know. That's how I learned a lot about 18th century artifacts. And Noel said to me something that was pretty profound. He said, Eddie, and Noel was an unusual archaeologist because he was a collector as well as an archaeologist. He said, Eddie, nobody will take care of your collection like you will, because it's your collection. You give it to a museum, it can be deaccessioned, it can be thrown out, it can be sold. I was a member of the Bermuda Historical Society, and when they renovated, things were just thrown out. And things that people had donated and thought would be there in perpetuity. So, who's right, who's wrong? These are difficult questions that aren't easy to answer. But I do think it's better to save something that's going to be lost and just leave it there and let it be destroyed. Now, the archaeologists would argue the intact object is no more valuable than the pieces. And they can tell you from the pieces what was there. But I still like to see the intact artifact in the museum or collections. That's just my own bias. So I'm glad to see that nobody laughed. So, either you're afraid of the weather outside, or you might have even enjoyed this. But if you have questions and we're too shy to ask in front of an audience, I'll stand here and answer. Then we can really tell stories.
They can talk all night.
Hey, thanks for coming.
So I'll have a whole thing.
No, YouTube.
What?
YouTube.